Thanks very much, Margaret. As time passes, I tend to forget about the terrific time I had in the revenue, and it does remind me of the old joke that this thing when we used to do when we were giving presentations to groups of small businessmen. We used to ask the question, what's the difference between a taxman and a taxidermist? And the answer was, the taxidermist leaves the skin. So, but it is a great pleasure to be here in Glentees. It's a great privilege to be here in Glentees. And I don't know, Joe, if the epithet that was used this morning in the Examiner is going to stick of Glastonbury for geeks. But this is a really important, a really terrific event. I say I'm also delighted to be speaking at this hour, and also my wife Maura is even more delighted because she's been having to live with various drafts of this presentation for ages. And then this morning on the run on Narran Beach, poor Donald the butler came with me, had to have a dry run of the presentation as we were going along. So you can all relax now. Essentially, I'm going to look forward beyond Croke Park. Blair and the Minister, I think, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect they're going to focus on the importance of Croke Park. There are many good things in Croke Park, particularly the provisions in relation to open recruitment and selection across the public service. And if I don't speak about those, it's because I regard them as hopefully in the bag, and they are hugely important. And my point is contrary to Ronald Reagan's point, that government, when he was asked the famous question, what can government do to address this problem, his response was, government is the problem. My view is that the public service and its performance matters. It has an essential role in our society, in economic policy and implementation, in social policy and implementation, and it makes a very large claim on our national resources. It is a costly business. And before I continue on, I just want to make the usual disclaimer here that anything I say here is my responsibility and nobody else's, and that particularly applies to the members of the National Competitiveness Council, who all have their own views on the issues we have been discussing this week. But coming back to the importance of the public service, its activities and objectives serve vital public purposes. They're essential to any civilized society, in any decent society, and they're often complex to deliver. And their quality, whether it's good or bad, tells us a lot about ourselves. And these are points that are sometimes forgotten in the course of debate. And the shortcomings, they're perceived shortcomings, but they're perceived to be considered. Well, I'm not going to go through the list that's on the screen there, but you'll all empathise with, I suspect, one or more of those perceived shortcomings. So, if only for the reasons of generating confidence, something has to be done. And we do need major step changes. And a theme running through my analysis is that there are certain things that matter. Context matters, rules matter, standards matter, and outcomes matter. And this applies not only to the public service, but also to the other two big themes, I think, which have been dominating the discussion so far, both banking and indeed politics and the electoral system. I would be tempted to get into the issues, the debate about the electoral system, and I see Gemma Hussey is down here at the bottom of the hall. But there's a famous article in the management literature that says, when you want A, don't reward B. And many of the features which require correction in our society, including the electoral system, the banking system, and the public services, we have been rewarding the Bs. So we've got to stop that and get onto something new. But just to go through points on this slide here, there can be no more trading off of pay increases for promises of increased productivity. The state of our economy and the state of our nation now is that we have to accept the compelling need to increase productivity. We are not by any means star performers when it comes to international comparisons on productivity. But If we do that, particularly in the public service, if there's no more trading off of pay increases for promises of increased productivity, we require transparently fair systems for pay settlement, and we need excellent HR practices. I have to say, as a former public servant and one who carried a lot of responsibility and consequently blame, the methods of the systems for settling pay are transparent, certainly when the outcome is reached, but I have great doubt about the quality of the HR systems. They do not compare with best practice, particularly in the FDI sector and the multinational sector in Ireland. And there has to be zero tolerance for restrictive practices. Restrictive practices are a form of blackmail of society, nothing more, nothing less. And there needs to be proportionate rewards and sanctions. And I emphasize the word proportionate. So why is reform and promoting change and flexibility in the public service so difficult? I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, there should be a concept of noble purpose about the public service, and Lucinda Creighton was very eloquent about the reasons why she went into politics yesterday. Her statement was a statement of noble purpose. But some of the underlying concepts of service organisation and accountability, have been diminished by all stakeholders. I think society, right across, all of us, have some responsibility for this diminution which has taken place. And a classic example, and the one which has been referred to time and time again at this meeting, has been the so-called decentralisation programme. As we know, it wasn't a decentralisation programme, it was a dispersal programme, but it was consciously and overtly projected as a plaything of populist requirements. And that is not the way a nation should treat its public service. Unfortunately, there are cultures of possession right throughout the public service which are stronger than cultures of performance and innovation. So, and some of the consequences of that is that, in contrast with the private sector, unsuccessful public service organisations don't go out of business, or they do so very slowly. So the essential drivers of change and innovation are muted. Change and innovation does take place, but not with the same compulsion as it does in organisations that have to survive in the marketplace. And there are, unfortunately, inappropriate views of costs and value for money. I remember when I was in the Department of Education and Science, the head of one third-level institution saying to me that following the publication of some cost data which compared the costs in third-level institutions, the cost of delivering courses across a range of similar institutions, that he got a terrible time from his staff because his organisation was the most cost-effective. The staff said to him, "Hang on a minute, you're not arguing our case properly." An interesting perspective. So how do we bring about the change which I believe is necessary? And I put forward three essential drivers which are interconnected. The first is to introduce elements of contestability and choice into programme delivery and design, wherever possible, to be clear about and to strengthen accountability, and most importantly, because values do matter, to renew the noble purpose of the public service. So, there are three categories, broadly speaking, of public service. There's service delivery, there's policy advice and implementation, and there's regulation. And first of all, let's deal with service delivery. We should avoid monopoly provision and provide for choice where possible. Not always possible to do, but our first instinct tends to be to see supply in terms on the provision of a service in terms of having a monopoly provider. And much of the public service functions like that. That blunts the incentive for meeting customer and client needs. It places too much reliance on the ethic and the responsibility of the people in the service. It makes improving performance more difficult. And a point I want to make is that contestability is much broader than privatisation or outsourcing. The IDA, for example, I think is a good exemplar of where contestability works. It is regarded as one of the best organisations of its kind in the world. It works and operates in an intensely competitive international economic space. So it has to measure its best performance all the time. But the other piece about the IDA, which is interesting, is the way it is structured, is that there are contests internally within the organizations between the different project teams. Not so much overt contests, but each project team and sectoral team is striving to do its best within the organization and to exceed its job targets. Education is another area where, in fact, we have contestability. In many parts of the country, not all, parents have a choice as to where they send their children. Schools do not receive budgets. Schools are funded by the state through a capitation system. So in other words, money follows the student. The same happens in the case of the universities and will happen in the case of the institutes of technology. They won't get budgets, but they will get funding through, effectively, performance. Contrast that with the health system. What have we got in the health system, as described recently by Professor Frances Ruan and her colleagues in the recent report on health funding? We have systems of funding of hospitals which are non-transparent. At best, budgets are related to some sort of historical deadline or historical pattern. So what do we get? The first thing we get is rationing. Queues in A&E departments are a form of rationing. So an immediately different perspective on the part of hospitals and what happens in hospitals to what happens in third-level institutions and schools. The London bus service is an example from next door, which is interesting. It's an integrated service, common fare structure, and a single livery. The buses all look the same. But there are, I think, about 30 companies serving on different routes, constantly being compared against one another by the Transport for London, which is an arm of the London City Government. And when we set up the motor vehicle testing service, did we have to give it out as a monopoly? Would we have got a better service if there were two contenders? Now, maybe there were issues of scale there, but I'll ask the question. And I'm going to indulge myself slightly about getting my own back for all the years I got drenched waiting at bus stops in Dublin. Dublin Bus is improving in its quality, but the poor quality encourages private car use for commuting. The average usage of public transport in Dublin for commuting is 21%. The comparable international city average is 42%. And I would blame Dublin Bus largely for that outcome. It has reinforced, of course, certain social stereotypes, like what do you call a man over 40 sitting on a bus? A failure. This is what the Dort generation would say. But certainly customer service is low in the hierarchy of values. But yet, curiously, when a loophole was discovered in the law and the air coach service was introduced, voila, what happens? Dublin Bus introduced dedicated airport services. Quite remarkable. Hadn't been doing it before. So, just to show why improved service, and this is a somewhat quirky, I suppose, consequence of the application of contestability, why improved service need not necessarily result in more public expenditure. The taxi drivers are pressing for a cap on numbers. They're suffering like most people in business. The minister and the government are right to allow free entry. But let's follow their logic. If they allow free entry into the market, why could we not relax some of the restrictions on demand? Should taxi drivers, for example, be allowed to look for business at bus stops? Should there be rules and regulations surrounding fare sharing into town? All of you have travelled abroad, you can see that fare sharing and journey sharing is accepted on certain busy public transport routes among taxis, yet it hasn't been discovered yet in Dublin. So that's a cost-free, no tax demand proposal for improving public transport in Dublin. Policy advice. And I'm going to use the Department of Finance here as an example. I want to echo, I suppose, what Colin McCarthy said last night. Let's not indulge ourselves by continually beating up the Department of Finance. It plays a vital role, and the people who work in it are hugely honourable people with a remarkable sense of patriotism, and we all have an interest in its effectiveness. But some of the things that are written about it, I suppose, illustrate the point about a lack of contestability. Dan O'Brien's point is that our financial management systems rank near the bottom of the class in the EU. He identified a number of shortcomings. No foresight capacity, no measures in place to insulate or protect the public finances from crisis or to flash warning lights, rejection of an IMF suggestion for outside involvement, and the apparent failure to strengthen human resources capacity during the good times. And the EU Commission found that Ireland's public finance arrangements were the most efficient among the 19 EU countries surveyed. Second from bottom came Greece. As Dan O'Brien acidly remarked, that has high predictive value. And Eddie Malloy, in the shot, in a sense, that rang round the policy world in Ireland, his articles in the Irish Times in April, commented that when every other organisation was being externally reviewed, in a manner of speaking, I wouldn't regard external reviews by the Department of Strategic now as the last word in external review, but the Department of Finance nonetheless reviewed itself and gave itself very good marks. So, one of the proposals I'm going to make is that there should be a legal requirement built into public service legislation for regular, systematic external reviews. That would enhance contestability and it would enhance accountability. The regulatory bodies have become increasingly important in Ireland, people like the energy regulator, of course, naturally enough, the financial regulator. But we do need to ask from time to time how effectively are they doing their job. We also need to ask, do we need them? I think if Michael O'Leary were here, he would certainly tell us we don't need the airport regulator, but however. So moving on to accountability. Accountability is a hugely important foundation for ensuring better performance. The transmission mechanisms between actions and consequences do not work satisfactorily in the public service, although, as we know from other areas which have been talked about here, public service is perhaps not unique in that. We need to explicitly link responsibilities, capacity, authority and consequences. Long series, but each word is important. There is a need for reform of the Public Services Management Act to introduce real and transparent cascading responsibilities. What I mean by that is everybody in the management structure should have a sense of what their accountability and responsibility is. And by doing that, we will encourage real devolution. And we will also enhance the self-worth and satisfaction of public servants, which is important. Why? Because we will be giving them the capacity and authority to do the job. At the moment, they don't have that, and ambiguity breeds frustration and low morale. And it also breeds a hierarchical system, because if you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do, you refer it up. Let somebody else decide. So, getting back to the Public Service Management Act, Secretaries General, interestingly enough, are regarded in some sense as chief executives, and so they should have a significant say in selecting and motivating and managing their management teams. But, in fact, the Public Services Management Act removes responsibility for appointments and discipline for everybody at principal officer and assistant secretary level. So, in other words, the CEOs have no control over the selection and management of their management team, or very little control. The other point is that responsibility and control should match, and we need to distinguish between political and managerial accountability. I can come back to that at greater length, if we wish, during the Q&A, that last point. Similarly, with state bodies, there has to be legislative clarity about the respective roles and responsibilities of management and boards. Now, Ed Walsh gave us a particular view of state boards. I've worked on a number of state boards, some of them are fine boards. But there is the phenomenon of some members of boards who are either, some of whom are not competent, and some who deliberately believe that their job is to deliberately undermine the executive. And, of course, there should be clear distinctions between roles and functions of bodies and those of the relevant government departments and ministers. Coming to appointments, ministerial choice and confidence in the appointees is important, but I'd like to see greater evidence of a test of suitability. Two very basic tests, or basic suggestions. Inform board members of their responsibilities before they are appointed and ask them to formally acknowledge in writing that they understand those responsibilities. Secondly, there should be structured search and selection processes through, for example, nominations committee structures and databases. So, coming to how do we do all this? The first proposal is to amend the Public Services Management Act. Assign authority and accountability and responsibilities as CEOs to Secretaries General of Departments. Won't require very much language in the legislation to do that. We should establish legally meaningful systems of cascading managerial responsibilities, and indeed provide for proportionate rewards and sanctions. And I have to thank Donald the butler as we were running along Narran Beach this morning for an insight into this. When something goes wrong in the public service, the question is asked, will heads roll? Sanctions have to be proportionate. Rewards have to be proportionate. And Donald reminded me that when sheep stealing was a capital offence, there were very few convictions for sheep stealing, because juries were reluctant to convict people, were reluctant to condemn people to death and to impose a disproportionate sanction on people who had committed that particular crime. So we need, above all things, we need proportionality. There should be mandatory, independent and external and recurring reviews of departments. I'm not certain whether it should be on a 3 or 5 year cycle. 3 years perhaps too frequent. It doesn't allow enough time for the strategic dimension to become apparent in the management of a department. 5 years may be, for some of you, too long, but it would certainly mean that each Secretary-General in her or his term would get reviewed once. And the membership of review teams should include international experts. But the important point is, what does government do with advice then? The government, ministers and secretaries-general, because they each have separate responsibilities, should be required to formally respond to the Oireachtas to the reviews. This would be done by way of formal written reports with proposed actions. And then the Oireachtas would be free to set up a review mechanism to examine those reports. This would improve greatly the deliberative inputs and work of the House of the Oireachtas. We do need a fiscal policy council, and I'm delighted to say, Minister, to see that Minister Lennon has raised this as a possibility in the terms of reference of the Doyle Committee that's going to look at the origins of the financial crisis. We do need all revenue and expenditure projections to be independently appraised and outcomes published. And it's interesting that great home of non-transparency, the House of Commons and Her Majesty's Government, have now established an Office for Budget Responsibility. So are we back to the old world again, of where we do belatedly what the British did? That would be rather sad, but I think this is a good idea, this particular one. We should apply similar systems of review and reportage as in the civil service right across state bodies and the wider public services. The fit and the details will be different, obviously. And then, let's begin the process of breaking up monopolies. Let's begin with road transport. The National Transport Authority has now been established. That should review the operations and performance of Bus Éireann and Dublin Bus against criteria. I believe they should explore the application of the London model. And then coming back to my point about taxi drivers, there should be structured mechanisms to allow taxis to look for business and to promote journey sharing on particular routes, perhaps. Let's just begin with particular routes that are poorly served at the moment by public transport. In the health service, the other great, I suppose, monolith in Irish society, implement the Ruan health funding report. Require the HSE to withdraw gradually from service provision, except as a last resort. For example, the HEA, which manages or is the regulatory body for higher education, is not directly involved in provision itself, but it funds and it provides strategic direction. The HSE, I believe, should be a similar type of organisation. There should be governance boards in all hospitals. It's interesting, a colleague of mine in the RCSI, Dr Terry McWade, did a comparison of hospitals which had governance boards and hospitals which didn't. Those which had boards came out with better performance in terms of standards of acute care and standards of hospital infection. It's interesting. Bring authority and responsibility closer to the point of delivery. And remove budget funding from hospitals. Money should follow the patient. Thirdly, then, and I'll wind up here, coming back to the point about values. The public service does not make widgets. Public service looks after people's health, it provides education, it provides security, it performs all the vital functions that a civilised and decent society need. And values are vital. We did, I believe, have a tradition of strong public service, but I also believe it requires renewal. And coming back to the point that public service standards, including behaviours, are very significant influencers of wider society, for better or for worse. Think of Ken Whitaker's comment made there recently. talking about writing economic development. The language is interesting, it's a reflection of the time. The important point is the piece I've underlined here, that the work which Ken Whittaker and his small group of colleagues, most of whom are now dead, they did on top of their normal duties. Nobody asked them to do it, yet they saved the country. So I believe that noble purpose will be strengthened by contestability and strengthened accountability. And I think we do need to change our assumptions and our rhetoric. I'm going over ground here that other speakers have covered. We do live in a republic. A republic is a res publica, a public thing. It is our possession. Citizens are stakeholders. These are the people we serve and to whom public servants are ultimately accountable. They are more than service users or customers. And I'm somewhat uncomfortable with the use of words like service user and customer, which have crept into the rhetoric. And the public service is a noble profession, and it should have a duty of service. But this is part of a wider project. We have a weak civil society ethic. It's been corroded by clientelism, inappropriate local preoccupations, and a sectoral focus. Other speakers have waxed eloquently and described some of those consequences. I just want to say that clientelism and corruption need not necessarily always be about greed. I think Barack Obama, in his book Dreams of My Father, wrote quite perceptively about this. It's about obligations to units in society which you perceive as stronger and more important than the state. And that, he reflected on, was the problem with Kenya. And this was the problem that his Kenyan relatives had to contend with. So structures do matter. We need to create circumstances on which the state and its institutions are seen by people as important. But developing this robust public morality will be a difficult project. Since the 1850s, I think the big influencer in Irish society was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was an authoritarian organisation. It played a hugely important role in a sense, in raising education and raising some standards in our society. But it said little about rendering to Caesar, for example, in relation to paying taxes. Perhaps understandable in a society which was perceived to be under foreign rule, but it said much about sexual behaviour. It had little accountability and very little transparency. And I suspect, and I don't want to engage in church bashing either, it's not a very honourable thing to be doing, a very pleasant thing to be hitting an institution when it is trying to recover. But I believe that this did not encourage collective maturity, a sense of maturity in our society. So 2016, as we've all been reminded, will be the 100th year of the Easter Rising, and I think we need a 2-month festival in Glenties to celebrate that, Joe. But we've had 100 years of state building. We will by then have had almost 100 years, we will have had 100 years of state building. And is it now time for us to give priority to strengthening the effectiveness of our public institutions? Thank you very much.